Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff passed away this week at the age of 71. His son Travis announced the news on his Instagram. He had been taking care of his father, who was dealing with late-stage dementia. There was a really sad video he posted a few weeks ago of Orndorff. He was either in the hospital or hospice, and he didn't look good at all. He didn't look like he even recognized who his own son was. My earliest memories of Mr. Wonderful date back to the first WrestleMania and WWE's national expansion. You know, when I was first getting into wrestling, it was all about the whole rock and wrestling era. So Hogan, Piper, Andre, all of those guys. Orndorff was part of that crew. I had my Orndorff LJN figure. By the way, AEW is working with LJN now. I don't know how many of you saw that this week. They're bringing back the LJN figures. I don't know how similar they're going to look to the old ones, but they are bringing them back. So I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, it was Hogan and Mr. T with Jimmy Snuka in their corner at the first WrestleMania against Piper and Orndorff with Cowboy Bob Orton in theirs. This was the very first WrestleMania main event. And there was an errant shot by Orton with his arm cast that led to Orndorff taking the losing fall for their team. That led to a babyface turn and a tag team with Hulk Hogan. Very much the blueprint for the Mega Power story that Hogan did later on with Randy Savage. And Orndorff and Savage are probably the two people Hogan made the most money working with throughout his entire career in terms of working like a full-blown program. You know, once each of those guys turned heel on him, Hogan was such a big babyface back then. You know, we're talking 86, 89. He was still very popular. Made a lot of money. But I just covered the Great Betrayal, I think it was last week in the history segment, in 1986. It was a tag team match against King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd. Orndorff was upset. They did this little vignette in the back, not vignette, but like a little backstage segment where, and I still laugh because when I go back and I watch it, the camera cuts to Hogan and Orndorff in the back, and Hogan, he's looking at somebody off camera. Maybe it was Vince McMahon, waiting for a cue. So like there was like a pause before he started talking. It was comical. But the story was that Orndorff was upset that he was trying to call Hogan during the week, and Hogan wouldn't answer his call. And Hogan said, "Brother, I was under the squat rack in the gym. I was working out when you called me." He's like, "Forget about the call. Get your head right. We got a match out there. We got to go up against Bundy and Studd." So they were already teasing dissension between these two. Hogan blew right past him when they were making their entrance, like a fucking prima donna. Just walks right by the guy. Orndorff is in the ring first. He tells Hogan, "Look, I'm going to start the match off. You go stand out on the apron. I got this." And Orndorff went on a tear, and he had the crowd on its feet. He was doing the little Hogan, you know, the cupping of the ear and everything. Then he tagged in Hogan, and Hogan did the same. And he got the people even louder. And you can see Orndorff, he's angrily banging on the ropes in frustration like Hogan had just shown him up. And then Hogan accidentally collides with Orndorff. He knocks him off the apron. Now Hogan's being double-teamed 2-on-1. Orndorff was back up on the apron, and he's just watching. He wasn't even getting in the ring to help. Eventually he did, and then he lowered the boom. Clothesline Hogan, gave him a pile driver. The prettiest pile driver in all of wrestling is the one that Paul Orndorff would deliver. It looked great. And that led to the biggest live event feud in the history of the business. Those two made so much money together. Orndorff was supposedly pulling 20 grand a week at the peak of their feud. Hogan, I'm sure, if Orndorff was making 20 grand a week, I'm sure Hogan was making even more than that. They sold out almost everywhere they headlined, because you hear wrestlers say that all the time. They were hanging from the rafters. We sold out everywhere we went. And 98% of the time, they're full of shit. They might have sold well, but they didn't sell out. These two guys sold out almost everywhere they headlined, legit. But the big match came at the big event. In August of 86, CNE Stadium in Toronto, Canada, they were expecting about 25,000 fans. They ended up doing over 60,000. and the first $1 million gate for what was a local market show. This didn't air on pay-per-view. It wasn't televised. They did over 60,000 people for a VHS they put out later on Coliseum Video. All on the back of Hogan and Orndorff. That match, drawing as well as it did, is what led to Vince McMahon booking the Pontiac Silverdome for WrestleMania 3. Funny enough, the rumor was always that if, and I don't know that this has ever been verified, but the rumor has always been that if Andre was not physically able to go in time for WrestleMania in '87 against Hogan, that Orndorff was the backup who would have been used in that spot. I mean, they did have one famous TV match, which is another one of my earliest childhood wrestling memories from Saturday night's main event. Inside a steel cage, both men climbing down the cage on opposite sides at the same time. Their feet hit at the same time. They did a disputed finish that led to the match being restarted and Hogan winning, and that was the end of their feud. But I got an email this week from Alex from Toronto, the site of the big event. And he was asking about the Hogan-Orndorff feud in '86, and as successful as it was, how to him it seems like it doesn't get remembered as a classic. And, wanting to know if that's because it lacked a WrestleMania main event, or was there heat with Orndorff in WWE, and that's why they don't really acknowledge him too much over the years. I'm not aware of there being any heat between the two sides. I think not being a WrestleMania main event like Hogan-Andre was, or Hogan Savage, or Hogan Warrior, that is part of it. And I also think that it gets overshadowed by what came immediately after it, which was the build to the biggest match in history, the biggest match in company history, Hulk Hogan against Andre the Giant. They probably could have kept the feud going to WrestleMania 3, and they could have blew it off there, Hogan against Orndorff one-on-one, and did big business. I don't know if they would have had 70, 80, 90,000 fans. But then again, they put 60,000 in Toronto. So yeah, they probably could have. But Andre betraying Hogan and demanding a championship match was a much bigger match. I mean, as a wrestling match, you could say Hogan-Orndorff would have been better. Hogan-Andre, it was what it was. Andre could barely move. Hogan had to sort of work around him. But you can't really vote against Hogan-Andre. You can't not do that match. You're kind of shit out of luck if you're up against that. But Orndorff was injured during that big program with Hogan. They were working every night. He took a clothesline from Hogan one night. He landed the wrong way, hurt his shoulder. He had a herniated disc in his neck. He needed surgery, and he refused because of how much money he was making. Again, $20,000 a week. You're on top of the world. You're working with the biggest star in the business, selling out every building that you go to. He wasn't going to take time off the road to go get surgery and then be out for 6 months? This was the biggest run of his life. But what ended up happening is he suffered permanent nerve damage that led to a lot of weakness and atrophy of the muscles on the right side of his body, especially his arm. You can see after that how much smaller his right arm is than his left. But he ended up in WCW in the early 90s after a short retirement. He became television champion. He had 2 runs with Paul Roma as tag team champions. They called themselves Pretty Wonderful, was the name of their team. And when he retired again, he transitioned to the power plant as a trainer. He had a hand in training a bunch of people, including Bill Goldberg. And he came back to wrestle at the Fall Brawl pay-per-view the WCW did in 2000. So by this time, this is like the dying days of WCW, the fall of 2000. And he was a surprise partner for the Filthy Animals and Big Vito against the Natural Born Thrillers. He still had that tan physique. He looked pretty good in there until giving a pile driver to Mark Jindrak. It looked like the back of his head may have smacked the mat. His body went limp. He was paralyzed for a bit. He suffered a stinger, kind of like what happened to Steve Austin at SummerSlam in the match with Owen Hart, when he got dumped on his head. He lost all feeling in his body, Austin did, for about 45 seconds before he was finally able to move around. I'm sure it's one of the scariest feelings in the world. And they quickly pinned Orndorff to get him out of the match. The problem is, he was still laying there, and they continued to wrestle around him. I guess maybe it was an elimination match. They continued to wrestle around his body as he laid there on the mat. Until finally Charles Robinson had enough sense, or maybe he got a cue from someone, to call an end to the match so that the EMTs could come in and help Orndorff out of the ring. So it was kind of a sad way for his career to end. I think he ended up having another match many, many, many years later. But that was really the, at least nationally televised, that was the end of his career. That was the last that people saw of Paul Orndorff. And the only silver lining, I guess, is that there weren't that many people watching WCW by that point anyway. How many people do you think even bought that pay-per-view? So hopefully not too many people saw that. But Orndorff had a reputation as being a tough dude. He was a street fighter before he even got into wrestling. E. Honda and Zangief don't have shit on Mr. Wonderful. There was an infamous fight backstage at a WCW TV taping in 1995 that led to Vader leaving WCW and going to WWE. Orndorff was an agent at the time. Vader, and there's varying stories about exactly what happened and what led to it. The belief is that Vader had shown up late and he was supposed to be filming something or doing something. Words were exchanged. The truth probably lies in the middle somewhere, but Vader slapped him. They fought. Vader had claimed that he front-face locked him and took him down to the ground. Bullet Bob Armstrong was there. He saw the whole thing, and he said Paul just beat him until Vader started bleeding. Dave Penzer, the ring announcer, he told ProWrestlingStories.com that it had nothing to do with Vader being late or anything like that. He said Orndorff's description of the fight is pretty much the most accurate version. I know Orndorff started kicking Vader in the face with his flip-flops. That's all anybody talks about. The flip-flops. He had flip-flops on. He kicked the shit out of this guy with his flip-flops. But that was the end, not long after that, of Vader in WCW. Orndorff was diagnosed in 2011 with stage 4 lymph node cancer. In 2 different places he had it. All of the treatment that he needed for the cancer, as anybody who lives in this country knows, medical bills can bankrupt you in a hurry. And he had burned through his savings. He almost lost his house. He had over $9,000 in back taxes that he owed. I think that was all property taxes. A GoFundMe campaign was started to help him pay the property taxes so he wouldn't lose his home and help him pay for medication that he needed. I mean, how sad is that? It makes me so angry when I read that GoFundMes are even needed for that sort of thing so he can pay for the medication to keep himself alive. But the cancer and the treatment had an effect on his memory, as did all of the concussions over the course of his life, from football and from wrestling, because he was drafted by the New Orleans Saints, and he went to camp with the Chicago Bears. So he never actually played in an NFL game, but he was a pretty good football player by all accounts. I guess decided that he didn't want to do it, at least the first time. He left of his own volition, so it wasn't like he went to camp and he got cut. Who knows how far he would have gone had he pursued a career in the NFL. There are a lot of wrestlers who came from the NFL. Vader, Brian Pillman, Jim Neidhart, don't forget Mongo. Who knows? But he did suffer a lot of concussions over the course of his life, and I'm sure that played a role in the issues that he was plagued by later in life. I think the last appearance he made on WWE television would have been the birthday celebration they did in 2014 for Hulk Hogan. This was right before Brock Lesnar's destruction of John Cena at SummerSlam. It was sad because Orndorff got no reaction. I mean, he looked different. He had this handlebar mustache. He came out to his WCW music. How many people would have even known that was his WCW music? But nobody recognized him. I do think he gets overlooked in a lot of conversations because that run with Hogan was largely kept off television and the injuries forced him into an early retirement. He was most definitely a draw. He did well everywhere he went, even before he got to WWE. All the different territories and promotions he worked for, he was a draw, he made money. And it's just very sad to see him go out like that with the memory issues. But make no mistake, Orndorff was a very big part of Vince McMahon's expansion in the mid-'80s and why it was so successful.